I want to just say welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Avo and Deep Sky Data webinar hosted by myself and Timo. So I am Stefania. You can call me Steph. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Avo, the analytics governance platform that helps people plan, track, and govern their analytics, especially things like product analytics, for example. And over to you, Timo, for a short intro of yourself.
Yes, that's a new tagline. I haven't heard it before. It's nice. And so, yeah, hi, I'm Timo. I'm founder and of Deep Sky Data, which is basically an agency focusing on the measurement layer. I mean, this is also like one of the reasons why I work a lot with Avo and invest a lot of time into these things. And I think there are several things that brought us together, but one, for example, is really like that we both share a passion for tracking plans, which I think at least some more people are interested in that, but I'm not so sure many people will share the same level of passion for this kind of document. But I mean, in the end, you created a product around it, and which is a huge help in a lot of setups. And we will tackle this today as well in different kind of areas. But I have an easy start for us in a way. So I think that the interesting thing is like, because when I do projects, it's still called in different ways. So do we call this a tracking plan, measurement plan, or even like the good old service solution design document, which is still out there, I guess. So what do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, just to set the stage here a little bit, because we're talking about Avo designed a product around tracking plans. I've heard this actually on a few occasions. Oftentimes when you start a company, the thing that you want your industry or the profession that you're serving to be called, it typically ends up being called something completely different. And for me, for example, personally, I never liked the word tracking plan. I never liked it. And also it did not exist when I started out in QuizUp, for example, when I was head of data science at QuizUp, or the first analyst at QuizUp back in 2013. It's a term that has sort of gradually evolved. And I like your perspective on it. It's way more than a plan, for example. And tracking is a word that I don't necessarily love because it has some negative connotations in it. But, you know, you got to own it. And I think this, interestingly, is becoming one of the most common ways of referring to this. But we still have things like telemetry, taxonomy, event schemas, etc. I would say.
I have the same problem. So I think tracking is the one immediately everyone understands. So this is like the thing, but it definitely has a bad vibes and not a good reputation. I don't think it will go away. So at the moment, I'm stick with measurement, which it's okay. But another thing that you just said, I think this might be the second area, which is really interesting to look into it. I mean, plan always tells you that it's a one-time thing. So you make a plan, you do something, and that's it. And I mean, this is like, I think the thing that we see in industry, and this is like, I think you see a lot, and also like it's an introduction to use something like Avo. It's really like, it's not a plan, it's something different. So, I mean, how can we establish that people understand this is an essential piece of the data stack that lives and basically is, I mean, when you create it, it's already out of date the next day. And so it has to stay like this. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really good, yeah, I highlight that in most demos that I have, where I talk about the typical analytics workflow versus the Avo workflow. And that's in fact true, that you have someone that starts specking out some analytics events in a spreadsheet. And then you start having conversations about that spec in a Slack channel or in person or a Jira ticket or something. And developer highlights that they don't have access to the metadata that they need to be able to send that property at that time. So a decision is made to either send the event in a different time or to drop the property or something else. And that decision doesn't get documented in the tracking plan. So you're right, it typically is outdated even before anyone starts implementing data for it. Yeah, but I think what we did at QuizUp, and this is, I think, generally a journey that companies go through. They go from the Wild West of analytics, where they just have a bunch of analytics events that random teams in the company have been setting up, and then they go to start trying to govern that a little bit, and that's like a centralized governance type of thing, where typically some sort of a data person owns the governance of that process, data team even, and sort of tries to step into the product release cycle and be like, you better not ship that without tracking. And I guess, in that sort of policing role of trying to make sure things are properly tracked, and also that the implementation gets validated. And then in the dream state, in the ultimate state, I think we have something like a self-serve analytics governance, where every product team is empowered to actually maintain their own schemas and plan their own. And I say their own, but I still mean that they're in a single repository of some sorts, because you need to have access to the entire tracking plan or schema of the company to be able to design good data for your part of the product. So I think this is a typical journey that people go through. And I think the problems around the how up to date the tracking plan is differs depending on these stages, and is less extensive and more extensive in specific stages, I would say.
Yeah. One thing that you just mentioned is really interesting, because I never really thought about it, but the process before something gets implemented already is producing so many interesting insights, which is usually then ends up in the Jira tickets or whatever kind of system you're using, and then get lost. And so no one really has this. And so there are so often stuff which then comes up later, like, why don't we have this property X, Y, that? And so why didn't we implemented this? And that's, it was in the Jira ticket that it was hard to implement because we couldn't surface the data easily. And and so if you have everything in place, then you basically have the history in place. And I think this is like something really powerful in the end. But you brought up another thing that I often get asked, and I don't really have a good answer to that. And it's basically like, who owns the tracking schema? Who owns the whole setup in the end? You already said, or maybe everyone owns it, but in the end, at least from my experience, it's like it's always good when you have at least some team or person responsible to, to set some rules to guardrail the whole process. So what are your experiences there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is another one of those that depends on the maturity stage of the company. And it's those same maturity stages that I just described. Before I get deep into that, I just want to touch on what you were highlighting with the communications living all in one place. It's one of the things that we really believed firmly in when we started designing Avo, and quite inspired just in general by GitHub, and in general code source control, where you have version controlling and source controlling of your code. And you also have, with Avo, you have source controlling and version controlling of your tracking plan or your event schemas. And in both of those platforms, you don't have to explicitly think about the version name or the version number or a semantic version or anything like that. That's one. And the other thing is like you have a history of all of the changes that you've made, and you can see that history from various different perspectives, including the pull requests that have been made into your tracking plan, and who communicated on those pull requests, who created them, and all those things. And I think that is a really empowering tool to have for your schema management, just like it is for your source code. And it's something that was really important to us to get right. And it's the reason why we've been built the branching mechanism, so that you can plan your analytics in sort of in like steps, and sort of have full communications around those analytics releases with all of the different stakeholders around every release. And that's a good segue into who owns this. And I think, so I talked about, very high level, I talked about the maturity stages earlier, but I can in fact go deeper, basically. The first stage in the Wild West, where you have just all sorts of data and you have no idea whether you have any data or what data you have, then you have typically like the decision making is blocked by just nobody getting access to data or having or knowing where to find the data except a data person, or data professional, data scientist, whatever title we want to use for that, analytics engineer. So the decision making is basically blocked by the human throughput of the data team, which is maybe one or two or three people at this scale. At that point, nobody owns schema management. There is no schema management, I can promise you. And then you go to the next stage, which is companies attempt to adopt at least a direction, something in the direction of self-serve analytics. And this is a sensitive term, I'm aware. I am a huge proponent of self-serve analytics, but I am also aware that it requires specific definitions. I think that is also a really important thing. So I'm not saying with self-serve analytics, I do not mean that anyone in the company should be able to access any data that they need and be able to answer any question that they have. That's not what I mean by self-serve analytics. But
and
what
it just works because you introduce a new tool. So
yeah, that is a good point. Definitely, like tooling matters for self-serve analytics. Training also matters for self-serve analytics. But this brings me to what's blocking still in that stage, in that sort of first attempt of a self-serve analytics. Typically, decision-making is still blocked by lack of data literacy and lack of data quality. That's my experience. Like people, you might adopt a tool like mixed panel amplitude, or even a looker based on, some computations that you have in TPT or something like that. And people don't really know what to look for. They don't know what the events are named that might represent the user actions that they have. And they don't know maybe that there are, in fact, 7 different events that represent this user action. Careful where you step. That is sort of, I guess, like the problem there. And I think at that stage as well, there's no owner. There's no owner of the schemas or the taxonomy or the tracking plan or the telemetry, or it's just, and I think the process at that point can be, I've seen a process like this. There's a product manager that releases a new product update, and they ask a developer to track the update, and that's it. And that's all I get. And the developer's like, what does that mean? I guess I'll just track everything then, or they'll at least typically in this process and at that maturity stage, you have a lot of different developers implementing analytics events without communicating with each other and without standardizing naming conventions. And you end up with, tons of different events for the same user action, which can cost a lot of slowed down decision making downstream. And I recently shared on Data Mishap Night the trigger for why we started looking into building Avo, and it's when so originally we built a lot of tools at QuizUp over 3-4 years. We painfully built those tools. And then we just completely revamped our data culture and our data quality. And one of the things, or a few of the things that we managed to accomplish, was sort of bringing all of those stakeholders together. And so this is sort of at those later stages. So I'll get to that. But I want to highlight that then the purpose of the story was to highlight that there is this incredibly underrated issue in these minor data bugs that a lot of people don't know about because they haven't experienced them, and they think, oh, this is actually fine because we'll just fix the data after the fact. But that situation can be something that you've arrived have had to pay steep cost, which is the story that I'm about to tell. And also that thing needs time investment. ETLs, or fixing the data after the fact, it needs time investment and maintaining pipelines and things like that, which means there is longer wait time from when you have some data about your release until when you can start making decisions based on it. So I have a really strong sort of hypothesis that the best way really is to fix the quality of the data at the root, at the source where you're creating those analytics events and standardizing when they're being created. And this brings me to the story. So after QuizUp, I started a company with a couple of friends, and it only took us about 2-3 months to ship a product update based on incorrect data. We looked at our sign-up conversion funnel, and we were sort of exploring next steps, what to do in the sign-up conversion funnel, and we discovered that 98% of our users were using email as an authentication method, and only 2% of them were using phone number. So we're like, okay, great. Let's simplify the sign-up process and drop the phone number, and those remaining 2 can go on into the email process. We'll then simplify the onboarding process for the entire customer base, or like 98% of them. We released that and had to build some things around it, obviously, and change some things. And in the meantime, we weren't building other stuff as well. So there's a lot of cost to making an easy decision like that. What we saw was that the sign-up conversion funnel, it plummeted from 83% or something to like less than 40%. It was crazy numbers like that. And we were like, what happened? How did that? And then we looked at the data again. It turns out that actually 47% of the authentication method was phone number without a B. So we completely missed that in our calculations. So it turned out that actually, or 49% was phone number. So in total, we had about we had over 50% of our users using the phone number authentication method, and the rest was using email, but we missed out on this. And this is what happens when you're running quickly with data. This was a complete bummer, but it wasn't only a bummer because of the, the work that we'd have to make again to fix this. It was also just so devastating to realize that we'd have to build all of these tools that we built at QuizUp again. Yeah. And that, everyone around the world was sort of just struggling with this. And so that sort of brings me to that third stage. Like, this is what you see all the time in like stage 2. Like, you see a lot of errors like these that are seemingly minor, but end up causing wrong decisions like that. Or data distrust, because you've had that happen to you. So like everything just happens a little bit slower. And then you move on to a stricter process. And you can do that with tools, and you can do that with processes. And the less tools you have and automations around this, the more time you have to spend on the process around sort of really strictly making sure that the events that you design, that they are not duplicates of existing events, and the properties that you design are not duplicates of existing properties, and that just covering your product in the right areas. And then making sure that when the implementation stage gets through, that you actually get some time before the product gets released to go through it and like open up your network tab in your browser and like confirm that the payload of the event actually matches your event structures in your tracking plan or your event schema, whether that's a JSON file or an Excel spreadsheet. And this process tends to take a lot of back and forth. And for example, one of our customers, Patreon, they used to spend 3 to 4 days on this process. That's 40% of a 2-week sprint.
Yeah.
And they cut that down to 30 to 60 minutes using Avo, because Avo automates so many steps of this process. And so I think that that's the choice that people have. The choice is you invest time in the process, or you build or invest in tools that automate steps of this process. And at this stage, this is the centralized analytics governance stage. That's the third stage. So we have the Wild West, we have or centralized BI team, also I sometimes call this stage.
Yeah.
Self-serve, the centralized analytics governance, which is the third and second last stage. In that stage, I think the owner is typically a data team. I think I occasionally definitely see that the owner is like an engineering lead, a VP of engineering even. And sometimes I've seen, and that also depends, I think, on the size of the company. Sometimes it can also be like a growth product manager who is ultimately going to lose their job if they don't have the data, right? Or a growth role like that, that sort of is thinking about growing the business, and as a really important input, they need to really understand the user experience. But I think the most common stakeholder and the most common owner at this point is a data team, a data professional that works cross-functionally with the product team, the marketing team, the finance team, on understanding the impact the user experience has on the business in various different aspects. Oh. And then you reach that wonderful stage where you have more in the direction of a self-serve analytics governance, which is the stage that we ultimately reached at QuizUp, and it was such a beautiful place to be in. And I see this happen with a lot of our customers, but also just like as I've been consulting in the industry, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this also, Timo. As companies scale, and as they scale and standardize this process and tooling that I was talking about in that stage 3, the centralized analytics governance stage, they start being able to onboard and empower more and more, I guess, less experienced people in designing good data and understanding what it means to actually design analytics events for your product release, and understand that it means that you have to design a success metric, and then you have to design the literal event structures behind that and the properties and all that stuff, and then you have to sort of go and implement that. I think in the centralized analytics governance stage, you have the data people that sort of run that process for every single product release. There's a data person that runs that and sort of pulls in a product manager to like tell them like, what are you trying to do with this release? Like, okay, let's then use day 1 retention as the success metric for it. Let's try to move that. And then they make sure the correct analytics events are implemented for that. But then I see like more and more companies or companies at that stage, as they grow, they start then onboarding more and more product managers, for example, into just taking over more and more part of this process. And the data people act as sort of like a support consultant, just like, that looks good to me. And that's also where Avo's review process comes in really strong. It works really well for both of those stages, I would say.
Very, very, no, it's really interesting. So I think I never really thought about this self-governance layer in this particular way. Of course, I thought a lot about it because, I mean, from software, we know the same. So software is complex systems as well. And the only thing to really keep it in a state that it works is basically the DevOps or the operation layer. So where you introduce monitoring, where you introduce governance, where you introduce basically like the guardrails that you say, okay, this is where it basically ends up, where we want to keep, but everything in between can be individually, and so don't have to be centralized. And so, of course, because this is not a solution, I see so many trying this then to centralize and decentralize and in between, and then try out self-service again, and it fails because it introduced new stuff, because they're definitely missing this governance layer in some ways. And the state that you just described at QuizUp, I think I see this so rarely. It's really, really, I'm not even sure if I would say 1% of the industry, because what people underestimate is like the effort that you have to take until you reach this. And so everyone thinks it's quite easy to get there. And there are not so many people experience around. I mean, in the end, like, I think one of the benefits that you had at QuizUp was like this massive growth in the beginning. So you really had to catch up. And so in other companies, it happens much slower. And so like people don't really build up the knowledge for this path to get there. And so this is what I'm hoping will improve in the next 5 years, because I guess governance is something that is now kind of the big topic coming up after all this modern data stack thing and so on. So like, which comes up later, and people realizing it happening on different layers. I really loved your take why it makes sense, because this was a question I had for later already, was like why it makes sense to invest into quality at root or at upstream or whatever you want to call it. And so because there are still people around to say you can fix everything in the data warehouse. I mean, of course, you can fix stuff in the data warehouse, but the costs, and what I really liked is like the time you lose, especially like when you're in product. I mean, of course, you want to know how your features are performing, and you don't want to do news, I don't know, 3 months later, because someone has to clean and transform the data and provide everything for you. So you want to do this after release. At least when I was in product, the moment we deployed, I want to see the numbers. Yeah. And I didn't do anything else, just hitting Command R to reload the page. Okay, exactly. Today it often reloads by itself, but at that time you had to reload.
Yeah, but yeah, you've touched on so many fantastic points. Like this is I remember one launch at QuizUp, for example, on that sort of note of like just having to change the data after the fact if it fails at the root. And I just remember this moment where we launched a huge release at QuizUp, and there was a board meeting shortly after, and the CEO of QuizUp, he obviously wanted to know the impact of the launch, and the plan had been to release or sort of measure, of course, the impact of day one and week one and month one retention. Obviously, it takes like 2 months to wait for the data for the month one retention, but you can get day one retention within like 2-3 days, the first indicators. And he started asking for it literally immediately, like almost probably 2 minutes after we launched. I was like, yeah, it takes a while to collect the data. And then we can, because when you're looking at day one retention, you have to have basically data for 48 hours after the launch date at least, because people have from if they join on hour 0, then they have from hour 24 to 48 to join on day one. And then if they join on hour 24, then they actually have, you have to wait for 36 hours to have a full day one retention chart. So that's really interesting. And that's a tough message to relate to your CEO. So he had to wait a little bit for that. Then when we started finally getting the data in, it looked really weird. And I was digging into it, and it turned out like, oh, okay, yeah, we broke it. It was broken. It's broken. And he was like, what are you talking about? And he was just waiting to be able to report something back to the board, obviously. And the board was like on his back and all those things. And so he was always, of course, like he was never shouting. I never got the hair blower, but I could feel his stress, and that's something you want to be there for your CEO in that moment. Sure. And you're like, oh my God, I mean, there are so many other things that we need to be doing right now, but okay, let's go and build a pipeline that manually calculates retention, even though we have a tool called Mixpanel. We were paying for both Mixpanel and Amplitude at that time. We were using both of them, and we were paying like tens of thousands of dollars or more. I don't, or hundreds. I don't. Yeah, it was crazy. It's a crazy bill. But because we really needed to fix that retention thing, we dropped everything as a data team, including myself and Thora, who is on the Avo team as well. She was my first hire at QuizUp, and she was also the first employee at Avo. And she's also on maternity leave right now. Shout out to you, Thora, and Eric, your baby. So we dropped everything for a week or more to set up a raw event pipeline from Mixpanel through S3 through into Redshift to be able to calculate retention manually, which requires a lot of effort. I'm sure there are some people here that have done that, and it's not an easy feat. It requires both a lot of architectural decisions that are sort of tough to revert. It requires a lot of computation. This was
and thinking, so it's not something that comes naturally. So
a lot of whiteboarding. So so it took like 10 days to be able to or more, 10-14 days to be able to get the CEO these numbers, because the data at the root was flawed, but I didn't even know it properly until like 3-4 days later, because it takes a while to collect enough data to understand day one retention, and let alone if you're looking at a longer term metric than that. So there can be a lot of cost in time and sort of decision making if you don't have the data correct at the source. We have a great comment here from, I just want to jump into them before we move on. Great highlight from Benjamin Bach. Thank you. Yes, tracking is such a vague term. It can mean anything from the raw event schema to having data flow into the destination to stakeholders talking about report and analysis. I really agree with that. And the same thing applies to metrics. I think sometimes people use metrics to refer to events, and sometimes they use metrics to refer. It's a really vague term as well. I agree with that. We should probably start like a centralized dictionary for this. So another great comment also from Matt, anecdotally from friends who left Google to work on data science startup, then pivoting into data warehouse management because data was done incredibly poorly in near 99% of all non-Google companies. Exactly. It is. This is tough to get right. Timo, do you want to add anything to either of these?
No, I would just say the last one is basically, I would say it's 95% of each initial story of each data startup. And so either on the one hand, like your stories, so suffering a lot when you build this stuff and really then take your experiences out of the company into others because you already solved a problem, or living in this great world that you already described, like where a lot of stuff is already working, and then switching companies and come into a state where you're like, it's not true where you are, and then realizing, okay, no, it's really hard to get there. So with most founders, when I talk about this, is usually often like the same origin stories.
Yeah, and in the meantime, we didn't just jump ahead and started solving this and building Avo immediately when we found that phone number bug. So we were still building another product, and it was actually quite an adventure. We applied to YC, Y Combinator, which we later went through with Avo. But at that time, we had a company called Visca, which was a gamified microlearning for employees. Also actually based on something that we were working on internally at QuizUp. So I guess this is an opportunity to shout out to everyone. If you want to build a startup, a great way to start is to work at another startup first, which is, I guess, what you were also saying, Timo, like solve your own problem. But yeah, YC actually offered us to join as long as we would do anything else than what we were doing at that point, which was pretty tough decision to do. We ended up rejecting that offer, but we couldn't tell anyone because it was such a conflicting thing. Like they were basically saying, we really believe in the team, but we really don't believe in that idea that we're working on. So we couldn't share it with anyone. It was a tough one. But this thing that we just that I just shared with the phone number story, which happened just in the first few months of Visca, we didn't immediately jump ahead and started building Avo from there. You know, first we were just like, we accepted the fact that like, oh my God, it's just going to be awful. It's going to be awful. And we're basically forced to choose between product delivery speed and reliable insights. And that was a huge bummer for me, because obviously we could not, as a startup, as an early stage startup, we could not just start building internal tools and spend a lot of time on that. We just have to build our product and ship that, you know. So yeah, we chose the risk of unreliable data at that point, which was disappointing and tough to do. We built some internal documentation in like some text file or YAML file, at least to have a tracking plan, or what we probably called it schema, analytics event schema. And that was it. No code gen, no data validation or anything like that, but at least, you know, a central repository for the definitions of the events. From there, I just couldn't believe it was so bad. Like I felt like we must be doing something wrong. That's how I felt. I was like, it can't be this bad. Like people, this must be a solved problem. Like what? I just couldn't believe it. And that was the start of us starting to talk to like hundreds of people in the data space, or, you know, not even in the data space, like product managers and developers. And I talked to and data scientists, and I talked to people at Airbnb, at Spotify, at Twitch, just all over. And my finding was, like I shared on LinkedIn this week, I think, you know, about 99% of those people that I talked to were miserable about this. And that remaining 1% was like, had built something internally. Not even necessarily. They had built some sort of a schema management, validation, blah, 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 sometimes code gen. And it's typically something that someone is maintaining, or someone built at some point, and then, you know, someone else had to patch it with something because it didn't no longer work for like the identify method of the analytics SDK, or someone else had to patch it for like, sorry, we now have React Native, so we need something for that as well. So, and it was just, and I'll never forget a conversation that I had with a former colleague at QuizUp also, who was sharing the current situation at his current company. Around Christmas 2017, and he was like so demoralized, and I felt that moment, and I just like, this should not be like that. And after all of these conversations, I literally felt like that was one of my biggest drives was just I feel so sad that data people are so unhappy and miserable in their work. Yeah. So
yeah, well, it's I think this is something, I think, when you have this initial thing, so I think it goes on when you then start to build your product. And so it's because this is always where you come back to really make sense. So we have another great question. So I think this is a great question for you from the chat. And so so there's a question. We're an enterprise SaaS company. I think our data maturity is very low, which I can say is usually like, oh, my camera is going on, so we'll switch it on in a second.
Internal temperature high. Yes. Allow it to cool.
It's basically melting.
Wow,
so I can tell. So honestly, in most SaaS companies, the data maturity is fairly low, so no problem here. This can easily be changed. And in this space, we are not looking at the standard SaaS metrics, and the big challenge is really to know what are the right things to measure. And does Avo help with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we lost Timo's video.
Timo's video is coming back in a second.
Okay, Timo's video is coming back in a second. Yeah, it looks like Timo's webcam almost burned out. Hey,
I have a second
angle.
one.
Thank you for reporting, Yuri. Yeah, Ólafur Jens Ólafsson, thank you for asking that question. This is a really great question. So I think ultimately when you're trying to measure the success of your product, you have to understand your business in general, and it's in general about that. So maybe if you can leave a comment here about, like, you know, how far you are. You mentioned that data maturity is fairly low, but where are you as a company? Do you have customers? Do you have revenue? Are you optimizing for user acquisition, or are you optimizing for early user experience, or are you optimizing for B2B expansion, or it sounds like enterprise SaaS, so that's probably going to be something around that. I'm also curious when you say that you're not looking at standard SaaS metrics, churn, sign-up rate, etc. Is that intentional? I would say, you probably would want to start looking at those metrics, at least sort of understand what they look like. And the challenge with this always is like, what's the definition of churn in my case? And what's the definition of sign up in my case? And what's the definition of retention in my case? So that's always like the sort of the tough part here. So for B2B, what you are definitely interested in looking at and having as like a thing that you understand around your business is your logo churn, so account churn, and sort of the really high performing companies, the top tier ones, they have 95% maybe there. That's the top tier ones. And then you want to, of course, look at net dollar retention, which is for each dollar that you get in your first year, or for each dollar that you get from a customer in their first year, how many dollars do you get in their second year, etc. But these are all sort of long-term metrics that you can't necessarily use to make instant decisions based on or as input into product strategy or market strategy. And so one thing to really obsess over, I think, is what's your definition of a product qualified lead, or something compatible for like that's related to your onboarding process of your enterprise SaaS customers. And so product qualified leads are what's, taking over the world right now in how you think about customer acquisition in the B2B space, because the buying behaviors of people today, they really depend on the end user experience in most cases. So even if you're going through a sales cycle, you probably and typically have to think about like, what is the end user experience of the people that are going through the POC, the proof of concept or the trial, and things like that. But even if you have like really long sales cycles and then just like the end users just have to use the product, you should still definitely be looking at like, what's the key value that you get to your customers, and what is then maybe like the frequency of that value? What is the proportion of your users that are getting that value and things like that? So answering these questions and what to look at and what to measure, it's a really philosophical conversation, really. And I do recommend Timo's recent webinar that we referred to in the beginning of this session, where he accidentally did not record the webinar, but then he recorded a Loom video after the fact. And there's a link to it in the Right Track community Slack, at least. And we can probably share a link to this as a follow-up to the attendees. Yeah, great. So
it will also become a YouTube video. At some
great,
point.
yeah, exactly. So, but in general, like Ólafur, this is the difficult question, and it's the thing that we highlighted a little bit earlier in the analytics release process that we talked about. The first step is always understanding what your goal is with a specific release, and how. That's the first one. And then you have to sort of get that insight sometimes from other stakeholders. You can guess it a little bit. Typically you can sort of assume like, okay, I assume the purpose of this is, X. And then the second step is basically aligning on how can you measure the success of that. And then the third step is designing event structures that you need to be able to measure the success of that. What literal event structures do you need to be able to look at that conversion funnel through the onboarding, or the day one retention segmented by which platform they come from, or which country they come from, or whether they had a losing first game experience or something like that. So in general, like this depends on whether you have any data today. If you have no data today, you should identify some of those key touch points in your product. Don't start by trying to track everything. Definitely don't start by trying to track everything. Choose a few select key points in your product that you think represent some key values that your users get from your product. Start gathering that data and then start digging into that data, and then you'll get more questions, and then you'll understand how to sort of measure your product. So it's basically a flywheel that you're building within your company, a data flywheel. Start something small, build curiosity with among yourselves, among your team members, which will get you more data, which will get you more curiosity, which will get you more data, which will get you more curiosity.
And I think you already pointed out the essential parts. So don't get lost in this metric question in the beginning. I mean, of course, if you have a lot of some experience, so it makes sense to derive stuff from metrics as well. But if you really struggle with that, as you said, so go back to the event level, go back to the usual journey, how your customers basically experience your product from the first touch point, so they hear about you from somewhere, and then basically trying out and so on. And if this, for example, if you don't really have an idea what it could look like, then do something quite funny, and let's say coming from people in the data world, interview people. So collect qualitative data. So ask people how they experience your product and so on. So you will find your events that you need to track so easily because just by listening to some people, what they would tell, what were their essential moments when trying out your product. And these essential moments that describe for you, these are the ones that you want to track, because then you can collect and build really on top of these different kind of experiences. And this, at least this is like my approach, and this really helps a lot. And this is also like a good example, which sometimes is missing, like qualitative and quantitative data really goes hand in hand, and really is often like a circle between both. So you do qualitative to get new ideas, to find new points that could make sense to dive deeper, and then you use quantitative data to really expand this insight on your whole, basically, customer base, and so your whole database.
So exactly. Thank you for elaborating on this, Timo. Great, Ole. Yeah, I just shared also a link in the chat. If you're watching, and I don't know if recordings show links in chat, so we can add some show notes here. But there's a blog post I wrote about this sort of process and this sit-down meeting that we developed at QuizUp, which we eventually called the purpose meeting, which, the first one that you host can take a little while because people are figuring out how it works, and sometimes you're talking about big things because it's the first time you're asking what's the purpose of something in the product. But eventually what we ended up having is like just really quick 30-minute sit downs where a few people would get together and align on what is the goal of this release, how do we measure the success of it, and how do we design the data. And these meetings, they just kept on getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and more of them would happen asynchronously. And at QuizUp we had JSON schemas hosted on GitHub, and eventually, for example, the data design, the event design did not happen in these meetings. It just happened asynchronously by the developers, and the data people would review. But I have in this blog post, which is called Tracking the Right Product Metrics, and it covers this concept that we call the purpose meeting. So I think if you Google Avo purpose meeting, then you find it. I talk a little bit also about what are good metrics and bad metrics, and what is good data versus bad data. So it gives you a few goals on sort of what to look out for when you're looking into this process yourself.
Yeah, very good. I have, so the good thing is everything worked out by itself, so I don't really have to look on kind of stuff I still want to cover because we covered so much things already. I have one segment which I definitely want at least one part. So in another podcast conversation with Tyler, which I really like, they have a segment which is called Underrated, Overrated. And so he quickly asks specific topics that are buzzing around in the industry. And I'm asking you if it's underrated or overrated. And I have a tough one, which I definitely want to place. So the modern data stack, underrated or overrated?
Misunderstood. Or vague, I think, or it's I think, well, I think like I used to be so allergic to this, all of these terms that people reinvent in every space. It just happens in every space. People reinvent terms for things that already exist.
Yeah.
And I think in most cases it happens because people are trying to distinguish themselves from the old way of doing things. And excuse my voice, I woke up with something in my throat, hence I'm entirely home. I don't have COVID though, so that's great. But so I think this happened, for example, I think with an example of my experience with this is literally business intelligence. So, for example, when I was recruiting for QuizUp, if I would open up a position around business intelligence, I would simply get a lot of people that thought about data in a more traditional sense.
Yes.
And I couldn't find anyone that knew anything about sort of product metrics or event-based analytics. And that was really difficult because I also did not know. I came from the genetics industry. And this was just really early. It was 2013 that I was recruiting for these roles. So every single person that we recruited into the data team in Avo, none of them had any experience with product analytics. And I think this is the reason why we keep inventing new terms for existing things. It's just because we're trying to distinguish them from something that we relate to older ways of doing things. And I think sometimes it can be helpful, but sometimes it's just really vague and doesn't mean anything. I definitely think that the modern data stack, like there is a concept there, but it also has a lot of things in common with how we have done things in the past.
Yeah.
So I think, maybe slightly overrated, I would say, but also really important though. But sort of as a concept, maybe overrated. But of course, as a marketing person, and the founder of Avo, we have to jump on the wagon and talk about it.
So yeah, Avo is a part of the modern data stack. But interestingly, the modern data stack always forgets about data collection. This is something which I don't really understand. So when you look at schemas or models from the modern data stack, so data is already magically there. So it's like it appeared at some point in a data warehouse. And this is interesting that it's a little bit forgotten. So I hope it really extends in this kind of area because but I think it will happen. But it's quite funny with this reusing terms. So for example, I can remember a phase where we didn't mention data warehouses in project. We called them data hub because we knew when we come into these projects and like the IT team or development team is sitting there, but in that case, it was always like IT. They have burned so many money with data warehouse projects already. If you come with this term, you cannot really have a conversation because it already creates the mindset in a specific way. And so we call it data hub, which was ridiculous because in the end, of course, like it was a data warehouse. So.
I love that. We are almost at time.
Yes.
We have about 3 minutes left. So if you have any questions that you would like to fire in right now, please fire away and we will try to answer them asynchronously. If we can answer any quickly right now, we'll try to do that. Yes. If you have any follow-up questions after this webinar, I will quickly share with you where you can reach us so you can ask those questions. But before we end, Timo, do you want to dive into another overrated, underrated, or another question that we want to cover before we end the conversation today?
No, I would say let's keep the last minutes. And so I would have another underrated, overrated, but we can do this at another time. No, like keep this open. So like also like if so we have the Right Track community where you can find us both. So if you have some kind of questions, I guess this might be the easiest way.
Yeah, I think that could be the case. So we have it here. If you have any follow-up questions, we'd love to see you in the Right Track community. You can always reach out to Avo, and you can always reach out to Timo
Yes.
directly. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Twitter, talking trash with hot takes, but also boring takes around all sorts of various things.
I have a fun poll running from today on about struggles in tag management systems. So anyone who likes to vote on their major missing feature in tag management systems. So very
love
welcome.
it. Okay, and that's a poll that's running on your LinkedIn.
Yes.
Exciting.
Just.
Cool. Yeah, so there is one question here from Frederick Victor. Please give us tips and tricks if we don't have a data engineer on our team, but we need product analytics report. Yeah, it's a collaboration. My tip and trick is, build partnerships and sort of champions and partners, build partner relationships with the people in your current organization that can help you get this done. It can be a passionate product engineer, a product manager, the CEO, like just build allies and alliances internally among the people that also are excited about this, and then get the first report done, and then build that flywheel of people getting more data internally. That's my recommendation.
To extend that 100%. So I think this is the major thing that most people don't think that it's possible. There are so many other people in your company out there who would love to work with data. And they have the same problem that you are. No one is asking publicly, or no one is really sharing it, because sometimes you're afraid that you shouldn't ask because everyone is assuming that you have to do this magically by your own. So I always talk to developers. So there are so many developers out there who would love to understand more how features are working, how people are using stuff, and so on. I think then make it a team effort, or even can it be a project team effort to really figure out, and so sit together. And so this usually resolves 80% of the problems. Don't try to do everything on your own. So I think
exactly. Awesome. That's maybe great final words. We're at time. I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us today. Yes. We will follow up via email, share the link so you can share this recording with your coworkers or your friends if you think we have tips there, our conversations that's valuable for them. And then join us in the follow-up conversation in our community.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing so many stories. So I think this sharing stories is something that we have to do so much more in the data community to really to see. I mean, like your story about what went wrong when you analyze the fund. I mean, every one of us has these, and we're always like, no, I'm not sure if I should. Of course, we all messed up things with data, and so I think this is part of the journey. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Timo. What a dream team company. I really appreciate this conversation today.
Yeah, me too.